Hi, Misha here, and I actually started this series on Russian armor with the T-26 tank. This was a light infantry support tank, and in that video I pretty much said that it was the first Russian tank. And this is the early 1931 version with two turrets. It could either be armed with either two 7.62 Degtyarev machine guns or one Degtyarev machine gun and a 37mm main gun. But soon it would, of course, be replaced by the single turret version. This wasn't the first Russian tank, though you could say it was the most successful of the early ones, and maybe the first successful tank. They built nearly 12,000 of these, over 10,000 actual tanks, and nearly 2,000 other vehicles based on the hull. And it was the most numerous tank, along with the BT series in Russia, before the T-34 came along. But in this video, I want to talk about what was actually the first Russian tank put into production. This little guy here, the T-18. It's adorably small. The T-26 is already pretty tiny. It's only about 4.7 meters. This guy is about 4.4 meters, but quite a bit of that length is actually this weird thing in the back we'll talk about. Tiny. I actually bought this on Halloween while visiting my folks. I was down there visiting family and browsing eBay and found this on there, and I actually got it in pretty good time. It came in about 3 weeks from Ukraine, I believe. Anyway, it's another Fabry Eagle Moss model. The turret does move, believe it or not, and it does actually have rubber tracks, and it's pretty chunky, pretty heavy. This is plastic. And it's a 1/72 scale die-cast metal. So the history. In World War I, Russia really didn't make any tanks, but they did capture and purchase some, and they were influenced by the French FT tank, the Renault. A lot of countries were, including the USA. So after the war, and then of course the Reds versus the Whites running through 1919, in 1920 they first wanted to try making a tank. So it was more of a test batch thing. The government ordered 15 copies of the Renault, known as the Russian Renault or the Ruski Renault. And they actually did manage to crank a couple out in 1920 and build all 15 by 1922. They were essentially hunks of junk and waste of metal. They were only, I guess they could move, but they weren't at all combat ready. But this was the first tiny step towards a tank industry. Next, in 1924, they would actually establish a tank bureau. This is when the Soviets are really kind of getting more and more of the old Bolshevik as in the way, and just kind of, getting all the old Tsarists out, putting the Bolsheviks in, kind of getting the old guard established, working things out, yada yada. And so between that time and around 1926, 27, they studied a lot of foreign tanks. They looked at their capacity, they looked what they wanted, and they would issue a specification. They wanted a 2-person light support tank. They wanted it to be 3 tons, so quite small. Maximum speed of at least 12 kilometers. Armed with at least a 37mm gun. And having at least 10 millimeters of protective armor. And of course, there were also requirements about crossing trenches and all that stuff, because they were still very much in a World War I mindset. Now, it should be said that the weight allowance was very quickly upped a year later to 5 tons. The little T-26 is actually over 9 tons, even though it was based on the Vickers 6-ton tank. So yeah, they quickly do rise. And actually, even though this is based on the French Renault FT, more directly, the Russians were impressed with an Italian tank by Fiat, which itself was an improved version of the French tank, so kind of the same lineage. And this is where our first tank really comes into play. Well, sort of. Started off as the T-16. So on to the spinny thing. By the way, Russia obtained that Fiat 3000 tank in 1925 thanks to some action in Poland. It was little damage, but kind of set them on the right path for this tank. Work began on a prototype, and the higher tonnage allowance gave them a more powerful engine. It was a 35 horsepower truck engine, and it allowed them to not just have the 37 millimeter main gun, which was actually based on the French, but it also let them have room for a machine gun, or two as it actually turned out. So a few other things. Now, one major thing, and everywhere you read it, it'll mention this, but this had a sprung suspension, which was a big improvement over the original FT tank. The first prototype, the T-16, was tested in early to mid-1927, and it did pretty poorly. Unreliable. It couldn't really cross trenches if they were wider than 1.5 meters. It just wasn't working out great. So work was already underway for an improved version, soon designated the T-18. It went to a better vertically sprung suspension and really just corrected a lot of faults and flaws. And so it was accepted in 1928 for production, and 108 were ordered. But they were only able to build 30 in 1928, and they did test them, and they found some major manufacturing flaws, something that would become more and more common with Russian tanks. Transmission didn't do well. The engine would overheat. It just wasn't working out great again. So they actually brought in a more experienced company, even though it was more of an old Tsarist one, to help production out in 1929, and by that time they were able to build up to 100 tanks and correct a few things. And actually they would lead to a second version introduced in 1929 and produced in 1930, sometimes called the T-18-29, which had an upgraded 40 horsepower engine. It had an improved turret design, and just really kind of corrected some bugs in their manufacturing process. So, yeah, that would be the one that was mostly produced. They would only build about 130 of the first pattern, and the majority of production would be of the second style. Now, Wikipedia says that only 128 T-18s were built. This is incorrect. They were only thinking of the original model. In total, nearly 1,000 of these were built. At least 960. Some sources argue about how many prototypes and tests, but only in Russia could nearly 1,000 tanks be considered a failure, basically. But that's how Russian production kind of worked. But anyway, by 1930 they were kind of off to the races. But that's also about the time they were going to Britain to buy new tanks. Kind of shows you how they were feeling about the T-18 anyway. But that said, what about our little tank here? What is it? In the end, this ended up being just under 6 tons, fully armed and loaded. And it was just under 4.4 meters long. Like I said, it has this tail in the back. That's actually to help it cross trenches. Even with it, it was still stymied if a trench was a bit over 1.8 meters. They did put a tail, I guess it'd be a beard in the front, or a nose, for a couple of test models to see if they could make it better. it worked in the sense that they could cross wider trenches, but it also kind of was right in the way of the driver and gun and everything else. So they didn't do that. It, what to say? It was faster than they wanted. It could get up to about 17 kilometers, but that was only on road. Off-road, about 10 kilometers, 9. Didn't carry a lot of fuel, had pretty limited range. Armor, well, the body, the hull was up to 16 millimeters. The turret was just 8 millimeters, but the real deficiency on underneath and on the top, it was only 3 millimeters, so none, essentially. The engine was in the back, and it was just gasoline, air-cooled, had a propensity for overheating. Driver is in the hull in the front, and then in the turret you have the commander, gunner, double-duty guy. What about the armament, though? That's kind of interesting, actually. It was a relatively low velocity, 37 millimeter main gun. They did consider installing a higher velocity, 37 millimeter, and did test it with that, but never put it into production. They'd already moved on to the T-26 by that time. Now, this gun was pretty at taking out armor by the 1930s, but it had some assets. For one, they could carry over 100 rounds on board. For another, it had a high rate of fire, up to 10 even greater rounds per minute. And that's pretty good considering there wasn't a loader. And while its armor penetration was pretty meh, using high explosive or fragmenting shells, it was pretty good at bombarding infantry or maybe light vehicles like trucks. So it was a rapid fire kind of anti-infantry gun more than anti-tank gun. But the machine gun is quite interesting. The original tanks were not fitted with the Dictator machine gun because it didn't exist yet. It wasn't in full production. They were actually fitted with a double barrel, basically 2 Fedorov assault rifles, battle rifles, mashed together. I found that really funny that they were using Fedorovs in these, at least for a while. And they were twin barrel, and they had over 2,000 rounds on board, and of course they were firing 6.5 Arasaka. Now later, they would switch the 2-barreled Fedorov out for a standard DT 7.62 54R machine gun. But yeah, just kind of a creative little thing there. It's an interesting tank, I'll give it that. And it was in service and it was in full production by 1929. And it did see military service. The T-18 was first shown off to the brass in mid-1928. And it wasn't just the tank itself, but it was showing Soviet industry. Now, it's easy to kind of laugh at it today, and it certainly wasn't blowing them away with its performance. It was based on a over decades-old tank, but it was better than the FT. It was a little faster, a little more maneuverable, but they really criticized its inability to cross ditches or trenches over 2 meters. But it has to be said, even though the armor and guns seem laughably small, compared to other tanks in production in the late 20s, it was on par or even ahead of the curve. And its vertical suspension was actually pretty good, pretty revolutionary. It didn't have a radio or anything, though, and like I said a minute ago, the gun was already pretty obsolete, and the 6.5 millimeter machine guns were just a stopgap measure. I think everyone knew that. It was first seen in Moscow during a parade. It's the Russian thing, put a tank in a parade. In fact, the first time I showed one of these models to my wife, she said it's a parade tank. Not just this, but any of these. And they would soon see combat. They would send 10 east in November of 1929 to defend the Russian railway system against Manchurian forces. 9 would actually make it there. 1 was damaged in transit and was actually scavenged for spare parts. At first, only a couple would fight, but eventually all 9 would fight during the campaign there, and proved pretty good. The 37mm gun, as expected, wasn't good against any kind of fortification, bunker, armor, but it was good about supporting the infantry, and its rate of fire was appreciated. The Russians did not lose any tanks in combat. A couple were damaged by grenades. Not surprising. And it was found that if the Manchurians dug ditches, tank obstacles, they could stymie these for a bit. Plus, again, pretty limited range and it's gasoline powered. All in all, a pretty good first showing. No crew were lost. They didn't lose any tanks permanently, just a couple damaged. But the shortcomings were pretty apparent, and this only pushed forward the upgraded version that would appear. But once the T-26 was selected and put into production, already by 1932, the T-18 is pulled out of frontline service. Instead, the tanks are shifted to schools, trainings, auxiliary units, and production is ended. Like I said, they built a little under 1,000. In 1933, they considered an upgraded version. It was known as the MS-1A. Now, another name for this, even from when it was adopted, was MS-1, or sometimes you can translate it as MC-1. This basically means small support vehicle, small support tank, showing that from the beginning it was meant to kind of help the infantry more than be a tank for tank's sake. It was not ever meant to go against armor. This is when they toyed with the idea of putting a higher velocity 37mm gun in, a few other updates, but they quickly determined that upgrading the MS-1 to the MS-1A, the T-18A, just wasn't economical, so they shelved it. They kept the tanks in second line duties. I don't think they even sent any to Spain for the Civil War. And then in 1937, there was a major push within the whole Red Army to modernize obsolete vehicles and stuff. And you can see this with the T-26. Here's a newer version of it. Now this is a 1933 version, but it gives you an idea. It would lead to the 1938 version and 39 version of the T-26. And they did consider updating the T-18. And they even made a prototype known as the T-18M. But testing and financial stuff just kind of said, hey, it's not worth it. It's not worth upgrading a handful of these old tanks that we haven't made in years that are starting to wear out. So instead, they actually retired a good number of these in 1938-39. Some were turned into fixed fortifications, essentially, pillboxes, guards. Most are just put into depots and storage or just scrapped. And that really should have been the end of it. But Germans. Immediately with Operation Barbarossa in June 22nd, 23rd, first week, Russia lost hundreds and thousands of vehicles. They needed everything they could get. So T-18s were pulled either from depots or schools or wherever and put back into service. Some were just as is with the 37mm gun and machine gun. But around 200 were actually fitted with the 45mm gun from the T-26 as well as parts of its turret. They also fitted a few with higher velocity 37mm guns, which as you can imagine was a easier drop-in thing. Again, only a couple of hundred were done this way. Some will call this the T-18M. This is incorrect. This was I think it should be called the T-18 oh shit Germans model. But they made a few, and they did see active combat, namely near Kiev and Voronezh. I've actually visited Voronezh. Spent over 26 hours on a train with a strange woman that I never met, but she was nice. She shared her food with me, and we were both so happy when we got to the city, because I was alone and bored, and bathrooms on Russian trains are not fantastic. At least they weren't 20 years ago. I digress. Anyway, they did do some fighting. and dying mostly, because this was a hopelessly obsolete tank at that time. There was no way this tank was doing much against a Panzer. It was just stalling action. That was it. And in its speed, it could be outrun by a hyperdog. And so after 1941, these were truly out of service. They should have been out of service no later than 1938, but, needs must. And only, I don't even know how many survive in the world today. Only a couple, if even that. And they weren't really exported or anything, but it was the first. And of course that led to the T-26, which I don't want to call it a failure, but yeah. And that led to the T-28, which was a medium tank. They only made 500 of those, so yeah. But then, of course, it all leads up to the BT and the T-34, which I've already kind of mentioned on this channel. So I just thought this was a cool little model when I realized that Fabry did one, so I had to pick it up. These are inexpensive little things. In the USA, between $10 and $15. So it's kind of fun to collect them. So I thought I would share with you, because there's so little info out there on the T-18, and there's virtually no YouTube videos. I hope I did an okay job. If you have any questions, please do post them in the comments below. And as always, I greatly appreciate it. If you could, like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.